when it tells me that. If you, Debbie, and you, Christine, would introduce yourselves, sort of why you're taking this class, what you're hoping to get out of this class, and how you've been keeping busy over the past 19 months in your art world or in your real world. I'd like to get a better handle on sort of what you want out of our 2 sessions together so that maybe I can help cobble all of those skills for you over the next 2 evenings. So Deb, we'll go first.
Oh, okay. So I work part-time, semi-retired from public schools, as I was telling Dave. And, you know, when there's a lot of kids to test, there's not a lot of time to do projects because I'm old now, so I just don't get as much done. But I have spent like a lot of the summer. I will say I did 2 outdoor classes at Frontline. I totally recommend that if they do it again. So it was totally safe. And one with Len and one with Mike. And the first one was with Len, and something happened that just like sparked something, because I don't always have like a lot of confidence. But, and Dave, I had taken your class in December prior to that online, but I just love taking, I will take classes probably forever, as long as I can. And they were just talking about putting their stuff on Instagram, which I never did. And I came home and I started that, and it just kind of triggered me into, you got to do more stuff, you know, this pandemic, the reality of, you know, everything that's going on. There's, you know, do it, just do it. Stop looking for a lot of schoolwork and just do this. So I'm, you know, trying to do more of that. And I kind of did experimenting with collagraphs and anyway, I like all of it, and I feel like I'm everywhere, but I feel like, you know, between Dave and them, whatever they can teach me, I'm willing to learn. And, you know, I think the screen printing, I always push to the side. I don't know about you, Christine, but it's probably my least on the list of, I don't know. I like the other ones better, the other types, but anyway, so I don't know if that answers your.
The 2 classes you took at Frontline were screen mono printing with Mike, and what did you take with Len? I'm trying to remember what.
Monotype, but he did, he used, and again, just the regular plexiglass. We drew from nature. We took plants right there from outside. Peonies were in bloom. So I did my peonies. And we had to use shut this is the dog barking. And we had to use with a brush, the Akua ink directly on the plate. And then we sent it through. They brought the little etching press up from the basement. I know, I have one too. I saw them. They brought 2 of them up, put them out in the parking lot. I don't know how they got them up because they're heavy. Mine is heavy. And we printed on Arches 88. And yeah, and then Mike's was using those Caran d'Ache crayons. That was interesting. And the Speedball screen filler, whatever. Yeah, very good though. Very, you know, it's just nice to be with people that I just like being with like artistic people. I like that crowd. And you know,
no, and I'm happy that Frontline has been able to do the outdoor things. And I would imagine, sort of like I will continue teaching some things online as the world gets a little bit more normal. I imagine they'll continue doing outdoor offerings, and certainly allows for larger classes, for more expansive classes, you know, weather. Yeah. Christine, what have you?
Hi. I'm Christine. I am a curator of prints and drawings at the Zimmerle Art Museum at Rutgers. And I'm not an artist, but I took screen printing with Dave. I guess it was 2 summers ago, I think. And I just have been, one of my big parts of my work is presenting prints and to students in the study room. And I found that over the last several years, students really, I mean, and they're coming from all kinds of classes. I mean, we have history classes, language classes. And when I say print, you know, they just, it's not something that's familiar to most of them. So I find myself spending a lot of time on the technical aspects of prints and printmaking, which I love learning about anyway. And so these workshops are just really wonderful opportunities for me to get my hands dirty and also find ways to make it more real for students. And I'm really excited about having all of these sort of like, for the lack of a better word, like non-artistic material, like not specifically artistic materials, just so that I can sort of, I mean, the screen prints that I made 2 years ago, like I show those all the time just to show the separations and to be like, I did this and I am like not taking studio art, you know? So I'm looking for more of that, these ways to just connect the art to the students. And the best way I've found is through like, just, they want to know everything they can about technique and materials.
Perfect. Our third participant is Tara Kraus. She is affiliated with Frontline Arts via Frontline Paper, I believe. And Tara, you can correct me if I'm wrong on that. My imagination, or my guess, that she will be viewing these on YouTube, and I will try to encourage her to join our second session next week if she doesn't pop in at any point this evening. So I don't have to do my whole introduction because I know all of you, but I will spend a little bit of time this evening, probably more than a little bit of time, talking about Intaglio processes, specifically our dry point process, and how we can convert some more chemical-based etching processes like aquatint or spit bite or other things to dry point. So we won't be working necessarily solely with dry point printing, which is what this class was kind of billed as, but we'll incorporate dry point and other techniques, even some other experimental techniques to really enhance our plates. So tonight will be, like I said, largely demo focused, largely discussion focused. I will walk through a whole bunch of tips, tricks, and techniques for really converting this process to an at-home process so that we're not so dependent on a studio or a press. Even as we, knock on wood, move a little bit further out of this pandemic, the ability to print Intaglio prints without a press is both wonderful in terms of the making process and part of the proofing process. For those of you that have ever done any Intaglio printing or printing that requires plate making, collograph, relief, etc., that may depend on a press but don't have one, being able to do this kind of stuff at home, the pre-proofing and state proofing and color proofing and all of that allows you much more focused time on in the studio to edition print. So really that's, even though I have this guy, he's rather small. So when I'm working larger, I do a lot of this kind of work all the time, this hand proofing, even though it takes a little bit longer, so that when I can get into the studio, all of the nuts and bolts are in a line. I just need to put things together. I'll walk quickly through the materials I've asked you to have for this evening. Let me just open up that file, which was here. The materials that I asked you to have for this evening and next week, some of which we'll use this evening, some of which we won't, but I'll introduce it to you all. And if there are any alternatives that you've sourced or anything you have questions about, let me know, because we've got another week to get a couple of things under our belts. So we'll start with the easiest stuff, 2 or more sheets of Reeves printmaking paper. I probably would say even 1 sheet would be fine, torn or cut into at least 8 pieces, if not 16. I'll actually be demoing with a fairly small plate this evening. It's 3 by 5, which fits really nicely on a 16th sheet of paper, which I think is like 5 5/8 by 7 5/8, but at least torn down into 8 equal pieces. And I have actually already pre-soaked my paper. So it is in a wet pack. I tore my paper down to size, put it sheet by sheet in just a Pyrex dish with some room temperature water, let it soak for about an hour or so, took the pack out, or took the bundle of paper out, and then wrapped it in a garbage bag so that it would stay moist. Before class next week, I would recommend you do exactly that. And I can send you slightly more detailed instructions if you need them for that. Just so that your paper is saturated and wet and flexible and ready to go for next week. For this evening, we'll just do some proofing on newsprint so that we don't have to worry too much about our BFK. After paper, it is plexiglass. I've got 2 5x7 plates here, although any size will work. Just make sure that you tear your paper down to the size of your, to a size a little bit bigger than your plates. I'm going to just switch cameras here and go through the rest of this stuff. On my tabletop here, right here, I have a larger piece of plexiglass or glass for mixing inks next week, or rather later this evening and next week. I've got some cut chipboard or matte board. Sorry, I'm trying to get used to where my camera is. Cut chipboard or matte board. This can even be cereal box cardboard if you don't happen to have illustration board or matte board or chipboard around. Just something with a little bit of heft so that it doesn't flex a huge amount when it's when we're applying our ink into our plates. If you don't have any access to that, for this process, an old toothbrush will work just as well. What else do we got there? Newsprint for wiping our plates. I also have a little bit of tarlatan hanging around here, just some sort of stiffened cheesecloth. You could even get regular cheesecloth at the grocery store, but this isn't necessary for these processes. I just happen to have some with me here. Garbage bag and a basin for water for wrapping our paper. One of the more important things you'll need are a couple of sheets, more than a couple sheets, of either parchment or wax paper or glassine, something that is slick and shiny so that we can do all of our printing without putting any new texture or any burnishing onto our paper. And I have on the list, 8 by 12 inch size. Again, as long as it's just bigger than your printing paper size, it is fine. It doesn't even need to be perfectly square. A bone folder, if you have one. If not, a metal teaspoon or tablespoon or soup spoon will work just fine. A larger piece of cardboard, non-corrugated if you have it. Again, cereal box cardboard works great. This is just the back of a watercolor pad or a legal pad would be fine. This will be our press bed for the week, and I'll give you a little sneak preview. We're going to set up some registration on there as well. And then clear packing tape or clear contact paper to cover that board so that we can clean it as often as we need to. Pencils and Sharpies, and then a variety of scratching tools. I've got a standard X-Acto knife here. I also have a bucket full of other scratching tools. I've got a couple of traditional etching tools, both that one and a twisted etching needle here. I've got a scraper and burnisher, neither of which is hugely important if you don't have them. Got a straight blade here as well. If I could get that open, a straight blade here as well. A couple of screwdrivers, and then because I have them in my studio, a couple of mezzotint roulettes and mezzotint rockers. I will show you what these do, but I will not encourage you to go out and buy these if you don't have them because they are ridiculously expensive. But I will walk you through what they can do as well. In addition, some resource images to work from, some disposable gloves as well, and then your ink. I'm working with oil-based etching ink. It's actually, I think in my email, I originally said I was going to be working with Hanko. I'm actually working with Gamblin etching ink. Doesn't really make a drastic difference, but Akua works really well if you want a much simpler cleanup. Anything that has sort of peanut butter to toothpaste consistency will work. I know Aku is a little thinner than that, and that is more than fine. And then whatever you need to clean up your inks as well. On hand, I've got a roll of paper towels and a ruler with a cork backing, although that's not hugely important. I've also just got some scrap paper, some scrap copy paper around, just in case I need it. Questions about any of that so far? Perfect. All right, so I'm going to just push all of this out of the way then and start chatting a little bit about stuff. So as we work this evening, it'll be important really to understand the difference between what we can do to print at home and what we do under normal settings in a studio, both setting expectations for what we can get and what we can achieve, and understanding really the benefits of what we can do from home without being so dependent on a studio space. And really what I want to start with is at least one plate. Now I'm just going to dig for my sample plate. If it's here. Oh, the last thing I have that I don't think I mentioned, just a sheet of black paper, because that's going to help you see what you're doing a little bit better. Or anything dark, doesn't even have to be black paper, can be a dark gray sheet, can be anything darker than white or the surface that you're working on. So when I do this with my college students or with adult students, so I can make this show up a little bit better here. The first thing I always have them do is make a sample plate. I'm actually going to flip that over so that you can read what all of that says. This sample plate is for them to understand how they can work with their tools, both getting an understanding of how to manipulate those tools and how each of those tools feels working into plexiglass or metal or Akua plates, whatever you decide you are working on. I also have them focus their efforts on using those tools in at least 3 different pressures so that they can better understand how dark that tool can get with a whole lot of pressure scratched into the plate, how light that tool can get with minimal pressure scratched into the plate, and then sort of a medium weight pressure there. Then I also, so on this, I've got an X-Acto knife, just an ink knife that I sort of jabbed at the plate, an ink scraper, which I'm fairly certain was my straight edge X-Acto, traditional etching tools, both in a line formation or crosshatch formation and in a stipple to get slightly different texture. Couple of grades of sandpaper. This is 220 grit sandpaper, but I've got a bunch that I can experiment with. And then I have them bring in a variety of tools that they find in their junk drawers or whatnot at home that will also scratch into a plate. So got screwdriver here, a nail file, which was like on the back end of a nail clipper that they just attack the plate with, and an engraving tool, which creates a drastically different line than dry point. Before we get, so I have them make this plate, and then I talk to them really about what the difference between their tools in dry point will do as opposed to etching. And that's fairly straightforward, and it really just comes down to how each of these work on, or how each of those techniques work on our plate. So in Intaglio processes, let me just swing this to the side so I can write. In Intaglio processes, the things that we generally focus on are traditional etching, dry point, and mezzotint. Now, there are a couple of other techniques in Intaglio that are worth exploring, but I don't want to spend a huge amount of time on them because these are the three that we'll really be focusing on this evening. Traditional etching is done typically with some sort of chemical and mordant. So a plate is coated in traditional etching, it's usually like a tar or asphalt based ground. That ground is allowed to dry. You then go in with a tool, scratch away the ground, and where the plate is exposed, a chemical is allowed to eat into that plate. Because it is all chemical based, if you're looking at the surface of your plate after it's been bitten, you get some really hard edged lines depending on your tool. When the plate is inked, find a slightly different color Sharpie here. When the plate is inked, that ink is allowed to sit only in those cracks and crevices. In dry point, because our emphasis really is on scratching, and it really is dry point, whether it's in plexi or in metal. In dry point, not only do we get the smaller bits like we would in etching, because we're working with a scratch, those scratches also create a little bit of a burr, whether it's with plexi or with metal, that sticks up beyond the surface height of the plate. When we ink, our ink can sit both in the same places as our traditional etching, but ink is also going to get caught around the burr. What this looks like in a print, an etching will give you clean, crisp lines. A dry point is going to give you slightly feathered lines. A dry point is traditionally softer, a softer kind of line, a softer kind of print than a traditional etching. The last one we'll kind of talk about this evening is a mezzotint, in which a tool like this mezzotint rocker, which if I was able to get you a good detail shot of this, the curved edge of this has a bunch of tiny, tiny little blades or little needles that stick up at the end of this. You hold this tool straight up and down on the plate. I'll hold it up in the smaller camera. There I am. Straight up and down on the plate and rock it back and forth. That rocking motion puts all of those needles directly in contact with the plate, creating a bunch of tiny little holes, like tiny little stipples, where ink can get captured. The more you rock the plate, the deeper and more dense the area of dots gets. So you get a plate surface that looks a lot like that. The deeper lines here, or the deeper holes here, capture more ink. The way a mezzotint would work is more closely related to subtractive processes or reductive processes. Once a plate is covered entirely, or an area of a plate is covered entirely in ink catching texture, you use a scraper, which is a sharpened sort of triangular tool, to either scrape out some of that texture, or a burnisher to press down some of that texture. And where you have deeper textures that haven't been burnished or scraped, you get areas of solid black. Where you have burnished or scraped areas, or burnished and scraped areas, you get areas of midtones and highlights. Just going to move my ink before I show an example of this. Oh, let me reach. Wrong box. This box. This is a really great example of mezzotint. It is a small 5x5, maybe 6x6 inch plate that has been rocked entirely. Where the plate hasn't been scraped or burnished, you get these really soft, velvety blacks. You get these deeper, richer midtones. Where the plate has been scraped or burnished or scraped and burnished, you begin to build in highlights of whites and lighter grays. Now, because this is printed in black and white, you get these rich, luscious deeps and these very soft grays. When this is in color, nothing really changes except the color. You can have deep, rich, velvety, luscious reds or yellows or blues or greens or whatever it is, and all of these soft midtones. Mezzotint is one of those things that I think I'd really enjoy doing. And then I remember that it truly takes hours and hours and hours to rock even a plate this small, and then all of the detail to go in and then burnish and scrape out things. But if you're interested, we'll talk a little bit later. Not if you're interested, I'm going to do it anyway. We're going to talk a little bit later about how to translate some of this kind of rich, luscious, deep, dark blacks and lighter tones into our plates later this evening. A more traditional etching. Pull up a good example of that. Something large that you can see. More traditional etching like this will give you, and I'll bring this up a little bit closer, will give you really hard lines, really fine. I hope you can see that. I will send you a photo of this as well. Really fine stippling in right along the edge here and along the front of the legs there. This super fine, super graphic kind of line that dry point won't be able to achieve for you at this level, although we'll play with a little bit of that as well. The two colors on here, this gray and orange, are silkscreen elements. Everything else is done in traditional etching. Etching can also introduce a variety of other kinds of marks via a few different techniques, all that really have to deal with that same etching a chemical against a mordant or against open parts of the plate. This is a print I really enjoy because not only is it giving you hard, crisp lines here from a more traditional line etch, this sort of splatter and smoke that exists around the base of the print is done in a much more painterly fashion, and we can explore that a little bit as well this evening in our plate making. There's also, I don't know that you can see it, but there's also a lot of small nuance in this plate, a lot of really fine detail and fine lines that looks very spontaneous, and my guess is that some of it is. This isn't my work, and I will walk you through how to create some more of that spontaneous mark making if more abstract work or even more nuanced work is kind of your jam. We'll also talk more next week than this week about things that we can do with our plates once we've made them. The first would be Shin-Collé processes, like these two prints here, where the color, both here, 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 and then the three colors in this, are applied to the plate in the printing process via decorative paper, via tissue paper or fine sort of Asian weight papers. Nothing I've asked you to provide, but if you want to explore some of that, I might tell you to go pick some of that up over the next couple of days. But it's a great way of adding color into the print without introducing more ink. And it's all done in the same, at the same printing process time. We'll also talk a little bit about a la poupée processes, which is using multiple colors on one plate at one time. So this is all printed at one printing time, and the plate has been meticulously wiped, meticulously inked, and meticulously printed to really get us a nice full range of color if you want it over the course of your print. The last thing we'll talk about, where are you? Is, oh, here, is viscosity printing, which really just will be about how we can manipulate our ink to be able to print more than one color on a plate to provide these really soft surface rolls or these much deeper, richer tones in the plate, really having entirely to do with the condition of your ink, the thickness of your ink, and how deep or not deep you've scratched into your plate. So we'll cover a lot of these decorative things next week, but I wanted to introduce them to you because there's very little that we can't do in these processes given just the limitations of being at home. Questions yet? And if at any time you have questions, just feel free to unmute. I'm happy to repeat things. I'm happy to go over things multiple times if need be. So we will, unless it feels hugely important to you, we're going to skip over the sample plate. And when I put this up on YouTube for you on Wednesday, I will also email a printed image of my sample plate, which will give you a better idea of what maybe some of your more traditional tools at home or your non-traditional tools at home will be able to do for you. And I'm going to sort of take this knowledge and apply it to my plates. The first thing I need to do is find what I did. There they are, what I did with my plates. So I asked you today to bring some resource images. And truth be told, I don't often, when I work with this process, I don't often work from resource images, but I will walk you through how to deal with them. And while I was setting this up today, it's been a while since I've taught online. And it's really been a while since I have seen this wooden table desk without it being covered in newsprint for other projects. And I really love all of the nuance and cut lines and age in this 60 some odd year old desktop. So this is going to be my resource image. However, I'm going to show you how to work with a slightly more traditional resource image if you'd like. So I'm going to start, if I have a separate resource image, with that image. It can be printed on just about anything. This just happens to be on transparency, but let's make this a little bit easier to see for you. And for now, I'm just dealing with this part of it. In fact, just hack that little bit off. Dealing with this part of it. Now, because Intaglio processes, even though we're not working from a press, require mirroring, we need to determine if our plate has two different sides so that we can figure out which one works best for us. The plates that I sent you, maybe I sent you a link for, I'm not entirely sure that I did. But in some cases, if you've picked up your plates at a Home Depot or a Lowe's or a local hardware store, you've picked up framing plexi, one side of which is shiny and smooth, one side of which is a little bit matte. If you don't have a matte or smooth side, and you only have smooth sides, great, you don't have to worry about this next little bit. But I have a plate that is a little bit matte on one side and shiny on the other. And because I know a little bit about Intaglio processes, what I want to ensure is that any work I'm doing is on the shiny side. And I'll reference that again a little bit later when we get into plate inking and wiping. So I want to get this image onto my plate. I want to mirror it so that I can have a print that looks as close to this as possible. Easiest way to do that, take the shiny side of my plate, flip it upside down onto my resource image, grab a Sharpie, fine point, thick point, whatever you got, and trace all of the imagery onto what really is the back side of your plate. This will work with text. This will work with numbers. This will work with other imagery that might require a very specific orientation. There's a little bit of text at the bottom of this that I'm not going to use. This will work with photographs, however you want to, or rather whatever you want to work with. This is the easiest way to get that imagery on the plate. The other thing I'm going to do while I'm marking this up is just take my Sharpie and mark out the areas that I need to be the darkest. So if you're working from a photograph and there's some really dark areas in that photograph, just mark them with your Sharpie, because when you flip everything over, a whole bunch of lines or tiny shapes might mean absolutely nothing to you. You might wind up with a reference plate that looks a heck of a lot like this. And if you don't know what needs to be dark or what needs to be light, you're a little unlucky in that. So make sure you're just marking what needs to be super dark, maybe even what needs to be midtones on your plate. And you can do that with a couple of different colors of Sharpie, create yourself a little bit of a guide. This is one of those things that translates to just about any plate making process. Just going to trace this other one here. And now that that imagery is on the back side of my plate, as soon as I flip over my plate and remove my source imagery, now everything is going to be on this plate, the mirror image of exactly how I want it to print. So if I'm working from the back of the plate, and let's just take one of those words, flip it over, and now my text, my imagery is all in reverse, so that when it prints right reading. Questions about that? Before we get anything else done on this plate, I want to walk you through a lot of stuff on this table. I want to walk you through this guy, because this is going to be super important. And before we muck up a plate, before we get ink on anything, before we even start scratching on a plate, this is the thing that we need to set up first. This is our registration guide. This is our press bed. This is our printing surface. It's everything that we need for really printing just about any kind of plate at home. And this is just, like I said earlier, a piece of chipboard from the back of a watercolor pad. It's about 9 by 12. What is super important is that it is larger, not significantly, but larger than whatever size paper you are printing on, so that you can capture all 4 measurements of your paper on it. And what I want to start, and I apologize that this is a little bit of math and might take a little bit, so I'll go slow so that you can rewatch this in the future. What I want to start with is by finding the center of all 4 edges. So I know that this is roughly 9 by 12. Line up my ruler, and I just ultimately want to make a big cross through the middle of this press bed. 9, 4.5. It's too late at night for me to try fancy math, but I know I'm going to need it in like 5 minutes. And all of these measurements I'm going to put onto this board with one color of Sharpie. That is just a personal preference. If you have better eyesight than I do, one color for everything would be fine. I am not that gifted. finding the center of this board right there. The next thing I want to find the center of is our plate. So again, working on the back side, I know my plate is 5 by 7. So I'm just going to, like I did on the board, find myself the middle of each of these 4 sides. And then to minimize any real math, I'm going to take this plate, line up the middle of the short sides and the middle of the long sides with the marks on the chipboard. That looks about as lined up as I think I'm going to get it. Get out of here, Mr. Haynes. And then just trace my plate. Simple enough. Because I'm going to wind up using this for a variety of plate sizes, I'm just going to mark this one, plate 5 by 7 inches. I know that I'm going to use this for this smaller size plate as well. Do the same thing. Find the center of each of these sides, 2.5. 1.5. Half. Line up this one again as in line as I can get it. There we go. Trace the plate. Sorry, I am really off camera here. Trace the plate. And mark out this plate with its size as well. Because I'm ultimately going to be putting a fair amount of measurements on this for a variety of plate sizes and a variety of paper sizes, I want to make sure everything gets marked so that when I have an inky plate and some inky covered hands and some wet paper, I don't have to think about where anything goes. I can just drop things where they need to be. So this is 5 by 3 inch. I can mark up this for as many plate sizes as I need. I can mark this up for abnormal plate sizes, non-rectangular, non-square plates as well, just by centering the plate on the middle of the board and tracing the plate out. Probably don't need to go through all of that, but I think you get the gist. The next thing I'm going to do is figure out my paper size. And on that, or for that, I've already done that on this side. I hope you can see that with that unfortunate glare. Let me see if I can crop that up a little bit. That's a little better. So I've marked this side of the board out for 3 size plates, a 3 by 5 plate, a 4 by 6 plate, and a 5 by 7 plate. Similar to how you would make a guide for a press bed. It's how I've set up my press bed back here. In orange around here, I've marked out paper size for the 2 different sizes, or rather in orange and green, for the 2 different sizes of paper that I'll be working with for this as well. In orange, it's a 16th sheet, so it's 5 5/8 by 7 5/8. Again, centered on the middle of the board so that when I place that down, it prints where I need it to print. Same thing with an 1/8 sheet of paper, which is 7 5/8 by 11 5/8. It's a whole lot of weird math, but just take your piece of paper down, mark out the centers of each side, trace everything you need. The final step, when you've gotten all your measurements on there, cover the entire thing in either clear packing tape or contact paper so that this can be cleanable, because we're going to get a lot of ink on the back side of our plates, and we want to make sure that we don't mar this with ink, and then this only becomes usable once. I think that's it on this. Questions about this at all?
Dave, I have a question. So when you're talking about the paper, like in 5/8, that's just random what you chose. I mean, if you've got a 5x7 plate, say, you might use, I don't know, maybe an 8x10 paper, or that's okay, or is there some other mathematical thing that
Not at all. Paper size entirely up to you. If you're more
Okay.
like a more traditional 8x10 size, the two measurements I've chosen sort of maximize the real estate of a large 22x30 sheet of paper, as if I were to
Oh,
eighth
okay,
sheets of sheets.
okay, yeah, I get it. Yeah,
Not the most convenient size for framing or exhibition. But
okay, that's why I asked. Yeah, okay,
if you wanted to do an 8x10 on a 5x7 plate, just mark out your 8x10 so that truly you don't have to think about getting things exactly in the center when you've got an inky plate and inky hands and a wet sheet of paper and like very little time to get it all set for you.
yeah, okay. And then if you were to switch, I know this class is by hand, so I don't want to, but I'll just throw this question out there since, some people do have the small press. You could utilize this by putting this on the press bed.
Yes,
If you were using an etching press, okay.
Yes.
It could go on. Okay, all right.
you can use the same technique and math to do this. What I would caution against is the thickness of your board
Yeah,
plus the thickness of your plate on top of your board needs to be accommodated for in setting the pressure of your press.
yeah, okay, all right. Yeah, I know this is a hand class. It was just a question popped into my head, so just forget it.
When I'm working on my press, I do all of this same stuff on paper and then just slide it under the plexiglass of my press so that it's all lined up for me. I don't have to think about it. I don't have to eyeball for center.
Oh, okay, that's a better thing. Okay, thank you. Yeah.
And then I don't have to think about readjusting the pressures I've already know for my press to accommodate for the board.
Right, you're right, yeah.
But because we're doing everything, at least for now, by hand, this is going to be sort of our make.
Right.
Cool. Other questions about that? All right. For now, I'm just going to swing this to the side and try and remember in an hour where it is. So I'm going to come back to my plate. I'm going to set my black sheet of paper down, and I want to talk a little bit about techniques that we can use to mar this plate or to scratch this plate. Certainly, we can use traditional etching tools. This one here is a diamond-tipped etching tool. This one here is a steel twisted whistler tool. Has two sharp ends, both identical. If you're in the market for tools, I would always urge you, not just because it's fancy, to go for the diamond tool because it creates a cleaner line. So if you're looking for a more etching type line rather than a more traditional dry point line, your diamond tipped tool, this one here, is going to get you that. And these come in a variety of widths, a variety of prices. But generally, it is just a very sharp tip. There it is, a very sharp tip on a steel stylus. This one, slightly more ergonomic. That twist fits really nicely in the hand. But because it is steel, whether you're scratching into metal or to plastic, you're going to get a little bit more of a burr when you scratch. So it's going to create a slightly more feathered line. And truly, nope, it's not on that one. I will send you that other image. You will not necessarily be able to notice the difference of these two tools in just the plate making, but it'll make a huge difference when it comes to printing. And I keep pointing to my press despite the fact that printing is going to happen right here. But both of these tools are great, and you can make any tool decisions you like. They're weirdly magnetized to one another at the moment. The other tools I'm going to bring out for this purpose are my X-Acto knife with just a standard steel blade in it, I'm going to bring out my scraper and my burnisher just to show you what those do, and a little bit of sandpaper. I'm also going to talk, although I don't have any, hold on, talk a little bit about using acetone and clear nail polish on these, or any sort of enamel nail polish on your plates to create different kinds of effects as well. Although I may have to briefly step away to go pick up some nail polish downstairs. I won't do that right now. But we'll start slightly more traditionally. Dry point almost exclusively, or rather in printmaking circles, is almost always line, stipple, or texture based. And it's just about going in, I apologize if you're going to see the top of my head in this camera, going in and marking out your lines with any sort of stylus tool. The joy of having this class online is that you can't hear the horrible scratching plastic noise from my end, and I can't hear it from yours. But you want to go in and scratch away. And I'm hoping you can kind of see that the addition of the black paper behind it really can help you see not only where you've already made the mark, but then how deep that mark is, or how dense that mark is. Because the denser you make those lines, very light lines up here that you can hardly see, the denser or deeper you scratch, the brighter that mark is going to show up. And that translates sort of in the negative to this, that this area, as bright white as that is going to hold a lot more ink because there's a lot more texture here. That will print a lot darker than this fine line here. A great example of this somewhere. Where are those prints? Sorry. When we talk about printing pressure, I'll show you this print. Now ignore the color on this print because it's insignificant for what we're doing right now. This plate has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of the same images scribed into it, each at a different size and, more importantly, a different pressure. The harder I scratched into the plate, the deeper I carved into this plate, the more dark each of these lines were able to get. And you can see even, I hope, you can see the deeper it got, the slightly more feathered those lines got. That's a little bit more of a blurry line compared to this much lighter line, which doesn't hold as much ink. It is much more of a thin, fine line that also doesn't pick up a huge amount of feathering or burr, just because there isn't a whole lot of really pushing into the plate and moving that plastic around. This is sort of a great example of pressure tests. But on your plate, at least for what we're doing right now, you might not notice that difference visually. You'll only really feel it in your hand, and you'll sort of have to remember how things work or how things were scribed. Having the black sheet of paper or the dark sheet of paper behind it can give you a better visual of what your plate is going to look like. So I'm just going to quickly just continue scribing in this hand.
Dave,
Yes.
I just wanted to ask a quick, so this is considered etching as opposed to dry point, what you're doing because of the tool that you're using.
So this is dry point. Etching,
Oh, it is. Okay.
if we're getting slightly more technical, etching truly is about using a chemical to.
Okay. All right.
If we think about it as umbrella terms, Intaglio is the umbrella, and under is etching, dry point, mezzotint, aquatint, spit bite, so on, holograph even. And you had said that you had some holograph plates that you were working on recently?
I do.
So we'll talk about printing those as well, because there will be no difference here. Now you have a press, you may never need to do that, but we'll talk a little bit about printing holograph plates as well, because anything that can be inked Intaglio can be printed in this way.
Yeah.
So this is sort of standard scribed line, standard cross-hatched line, and for good measure, let's put in a little bit of a stipple that you're not necessarily going to be able to see on camera, but I can see here. You'll definitely see it when we print it. And really, I'm not looking at the moment. Clearly, I'm not making any sort of great art. I am making just a slightly more planned sampler plate so that when we print this, you can see. Let's throw in a little bit of imagery there as well. A little bit of spiral. Not much that you can see on your end. If I catch it in the right light, there it is. You can see that a little bit better. So these two tools are essentially going to make the same kind of line, because what it's doing is scratching away, creating that deeper burr, depending on how deep you scratch, and creating that slightly feathered line. The difference between this and an X-Acto is that an X-Acto is actually going to cut into the plate. I can score some pretty deep or pretty shallow lines with my X-Acto knife, and because I'm not really moving much of the plate, the burr on an X-Acto line is much less. This is going to give me a much cleaner, less feathered line. However, in plexiglass, an X-Acto knife is a little bit harder to control. So I would say if you want to work with this, do a little bit of a sampler on the back side of a plate or on a different plate to really get the control down to give you the kind of line work you want. I find with an X-Acto knife, I can get slightly more significantly more fluid curvilinear lines, because it is cutting right through the grain or the face of the plexi, whereas this, the scratching tool, needs to scratch against the grain of the plexi. So it's a little bit harder to capture more curvilinear line work in that. The final tools that I want to talk about right now are our scraper and our burnisher. Like I said, our scraper, this one here, is a three-sided, essentially, knife. The triangle points on this are fairly sharp and really can go in and do two things. They can create their own texture, and here you can really see the burr that I'm picking up by scraping away at this plate right here. Can create its own very soft texture, actually. It's very airy, almost cottony texture, because you're just sort of shaving away the face of the plate, creating a slightly more matte surface. Or I can go in on lines that I've already made, and with a super light hand, scrape away some of that excess burr. So if I'm super concerned that my lines might be more feathered than I'd like them to be, going in with my scraper and scraping them away will give me a slightly more crisp line where I might be concerned about that. Much smoother up there. The burnisher in traditional etching or on anything really with metal, even dry point on metal, is really meant to push a metal burr or softer metal back together. So on plexi, it works. It's just not hugely successful. But if you have something that you don't love in your plate, either pre-proofing or after proofing, you can use your burnisher rather, and just in small circular strokes, push that burr back into the line. This will not get rid of deep, heavy line work, deep scratched line work up here, but this very thin line work that I did around that hand image, that hand icon, I can get much of that removed just by burnishing away some of that texture. Plexiglass, or that Akua plexi as well, that PETC plexi, because it is fairly brittle when it is scratched, once the burr is really moved or manipulated, most of that burr, like you saw when I was scraping here, most of that burr is going to just snap off the surface of the plate. It's still going to leave that feathery texture here. But unlike metal, where when we can scratch into metal, the metal is stronger, it's going to hold on longer and can be pushed back into those crevices or manipulated back if we've done some traditional etching, manipulated back with our scraper and our burnisher. Plexiglass doesn't have sort of the same success rate with the burnisher, but if you've got one, try it and see what you can manage. The less traditional tools that I like to explore: screwdrivers and some sandpaper. We'll start with the sandpaper because I think it's going to give you the best impression. And I have a variety of sandpapers here. I've got 80, I think, to 150, and I've got some wet dry sandpaper as well, that black sandpaper. And the heavier, this sort of should go without saying, the heavier the texture of the sandpaper, so the lower the number, the more scratch, the more texture you're getting into the plate. And you can work this truly all over the plate, and it will begin to mimic for you that mezzotint texture. It's going to get you those deep, rich, velvety blacks. But what I would suggest, the only sort of trick with sandpaper, even with a low number grit, so a very gritty sandpaper, a low number grit sandpaper, the more you sand in one area, the more texture you're actually removing from the plate. So using sandpaper needs to be something that you either start with, sorry, I grabbed the wrong one, start with a low grit sandpaper to build up what will essentially be your mid-tone grays. And then on top of that, work with a much higher grit sandpaper, so something with a lower number like an 80, and just do some selective scratching, so that what you're creating is this sort of nest of different depth scratches that's going to mimic that mezzotint for you. If you rub the whole plate with 150 grit sandpaper, all you've done is created just a slightly light texture on the plate that's not going to carry those same rich velvety blacks. Yeah, if there are specific areas you want to designate on your plate for this sort of velvety black area, and you don't trust yourself to keep it into just those tiny areas, quick trick, reach, grab some painter's tape or some masking tape, mask off the area of the plate that you want to sand. Make sure it's down nice and tight. I think that's 150. And sand to your heart's content. That will give you harder edged lines and a much more consistent area, or rather finite area of sanding there for you. You can do the same thing by masking off larger areas of your plate, covering them entirely in masking tape, using your X-Acto knife lightly, because you don't want to mark your plate necessarily. To open up specifically shaped space little places to sand. And again, make sure those edges are down. And do any sanding that you need to do. Now, just like working with a brush in a monoprint or a painting, sandpaper is going to leave sort of a brush stroke. So you can use that to your advantage as well by only scraping the plate with your sandpaper in one direction or a handful of directions, depending on the kind of mark you're looking to leave. The other two things that work really well on plates, I guess that this is where I might have to run downstairs and grab some, because I don't think I have any up here, is acetone and clear nail polish. I will show you an example of both in plate form and in print form. Slide that to the side. Acetone or acetone-based nail polish remover will eat through certain brands of plexiglass, and you will need to experiment with that and see if it's what you got. I like using straight acetone because it's a little bit more predictable, but acetone is going to give you sort of a very, we talked a little bit earlier on that other print about those cloudy, smoky sections. Acetone is going to do that for you. It's going to eat away at the surface plastic. I have 3 examples of this. Eat away at the surface plastic, and when that is printed, you're going to get these much more airy, much more watercolory, if you're familiar with litho at all, much more touche wash kind of marks, depending on how much manipulating you do with the plate. So this purple one down here, I just dropped the acetone on and let it sit to eat the plate. And it created these ridges around each of those drops. Now, this scratch was already in the plate. That was not acetone. When I wasn't super happy with that, although it has its own place as a technique, I used the same plate, dropped some more acetone, and agitated it with a bristle brush, with a slightly heavier, harder bristle brush. And it really ate away at the surface of this plate, giving me a lot more texture on the plate. That's this one. A lot more texture on the plate that could then allow for that cloudy, more airy, more ethereal, more smoky kind of mark making. Once I experimented with that, I moved into this plate and really manipulated how much acetone, how much time, and how much agitation I can do to this. So the bottom of this plate got significantly more acetone, probably 3 or 4 coatings of acetone. Put the acetone on, agitate it, let it dry, put more acetone on, agitate it, let it dry, really building up these darker areas, or if this was printed in black, these slightly more darker areas, and building up to this much more spotty texture up here, which really is just little bits of plexi that came off in the agitation, drying and sticking to the plate. That it just plastic melted into more plastic, and it creates this thing. If you're going to work with acetone, do it in a well-ventilated space, do it outside. This is a fairly stinky process.
Dave, I'm sorry, can I just ask then, how do you prep the plate then for printing? You have to clean it off in some way, right? So
the acetone is going to dry on the plate, leaving you essentially a grease-free plate. But before I print these, I usually just run them under a little bit of cool water with some dish soap to remove any, whether it's a plate with acetone, without acetone. I want to get as much grease off the plate as possible. So a little bit of dish soap and water will take care of that.
Okay.
Now, I am showing you sort of straight acetone processes. What you can do once you've built up these cloudier areas, nothing has stopped you from then going in with your tools and making new line work on top of that. So now you're going to get that smoky, cloudy texture with much more linear work. And if you really want to push it a little bit, more than a little bit, I'll show you this plate. And where are those prints? Look at that. This is the first print from that. So this plate here, bring that up a little bit higher for you, get the glare off of that. This plate here has some scratching into it, has some sandpaper, some more traditional line etching, and these clear dots down at the bottom here, as well as the clear dots up at the top here, right about there, are just clear nail polish, clear enamel nail polish dripped onto the plate, both into areas where there was no line work, no texture, and areas where there was line work and texture, so that you can see how each of those areas are then influenced by this. This is the first print off that plate. I have all but essentially erased the texture that I've put on the plate by adding nail polish on top of it. That nail polish is going to find its own level. It's going to fill in the areas you want it to, and it's going to create areas of highlight in areas that are pretty deeply etched or pretty deeply scratched. When that nail polish is dripped in areas where there's no previous scratching, the edges of the dried nail polish, the sides of each of those puddles, will then act a little bit like a collograph plate, which is entirely a plate built with texture, so that the ink, when the plate is inked, actually catches along the edge of those dots. The dots still come up as clean white dots, but now I've created almost perfect circles. Nail polish doesn't only have to be used in dots. I have a student in the class that I'm teaching in summer, in Summit rather, who's covered much of her plate with texture and then applied dots of nail polish. She's applied strokes of nail polish with the brush and created these very bright brush strokes. She's gone in and applied nail polish, and then while it was drying, used her thumb to push some of that nail polish away. So you're pushing away the skin of the nail polish and creating new texture to it. This is creating for you all new textures on this plate that not only will print in beautiful ways in a one color intaglio print like this, but will also work for viscosity printing and similarly collograph printing, because you're creating different heights on the plate now as well. If you've got some nail polish, doesn't have to be clear, I just had clear nail polish around. This is something I think that's worth exploring, not only as a way to maybe erase some marks that you might not love, but to play with creating areas of highlight or midtone by manipulating that nail polish. The one downside of nail polish on your plate is that because nail polish is broken down with acetone or nail polish remover, you have to be really careful about cleaning your plates at the end of your printing session. If you're just cleaning with mineral spirits or vegetable oil or dish soap, depending on the kind of ink you're working with, none of that is going to take the enamel nail polish off the plate. But if you want to introduce an acetone process or want to degrease your plate with acetone or vinegar or denatured alcohol or anything, that is going to impact the nail polish on your plate. Also, something that might be worth exploring to see what each of those does to previously dried nail polish on the plate. Certainly interesting textures. The more we work with these processes, and as we work into some more of those decorative processes next week, we can begin to get some more plates that play with imagery and color and texture that allow for slightly more realized imagery. Again, sample plates, not making beautiful art here, but can begin to think about how we're inking up plates in a couple of different colors, how we're involving Shinkolei into this, how we might involve a viscosity or surface roll into this, and ultimately, or rather what we'll talk about next week, how we might combine multiple dry point plates printed one on top of another to create much more fully realized images. But all things worth exploring when it comes to mark making. What I do want to encourage you, whether tonight or over the next week, is even if the acetone or nail polish isn't the kind of vocabulary you speak in art making, or isn't something that you might think you'll find overly interesting to work on, make a small sample plate that explores things that you didn't think or that you don't think will be interesting to you. Because I can guarantee you they're going to open up some doors or some other possibilities that even if you don't, like I said, even if you're not dropping nail polish on to create bright white circles, manipulating that nail polish with your finger as it dries, or manipulating the acetone with a different kind of brush, maybe with a toothbrush as opposed to a bristle brush, or manipulating any other kind of tool on the plate is going to be an interesting road to travel down, even if only for a couple of minutes. The last couple of tools that I like to use, or that I explore using in dry point, are screwdrivers, both as scratching tools, because they're not super sharp, but they can create some interesting mark, or, sorry if that's super loud, or as a way to bring cracks or other kinds of marks into your plate. And I didn't take it out because it's loud and in the other room. A Dremel tool, which is a mechanical like hand tool, like almost a hand drill, that creates much more repetitive kind of line work. Where is that print? Sorry, reaching again. There it is. Much more repetitive kind of line work that creates this almost dotted or reciprocating kind of line that feels very almost stitched because it's hitting the plate at very specific patterns, but can create this very soft, almost illustrative line that feels different, very different than a scratched line or a sanded line or an X-Acto knife line. And any kind of drill or Dremel tool will make this. It's all about just finding the right nib or finding the right drill bit to really get your marks worked in there. Once you have your plate made, I swear we're getting there. I'm just going to move all of this stuff off the table. Need this, don't need any of this. I don't think that because the plate I need is here. Once you have your plate made, it really is then time to proof your plate. And that's the first real instance of like making prints without a press by hand. Before I jump into that, questions at all? Cool. If there are, just ask. About proofing your plate so that you can get a better sense of what your prints look like. Most printmakers, as they develop their intaglio plates, whether it's etching or mezzotint or dry point, etc. We'll do a variety of proofing or many steps of proofing to get the richness of the plate that they are looking for. And I can show you some of that in here. So this was all the trial proofing I did for this plate to get it to where I thought it was ready to be editioned. And you can see in sort of most drastic terms, the difference between this print and this print. The very first proof that came off and the proof that I was happy enough with to print, to start editioning. As I worked on this plate, all I did was just proof onto paper and then with colored pencil, figure out where else the plate needed more work in order to build up the dimension, the darkness, the richness, the texture that I was looking for. Here, I know I needed to darken here. I needed to darken the sort of slash here, bring in a little bit more texture up at the top here and a little bit more along the right side. As I printed that out, gotten a little bit darker in here. I wanted to add a little bit more stippling in here and here. That eventually got in there, and then I wanted to darken just a smidge more to get myself to this point. Once I was happy with the plate to edition, I could then do that edition. Let's see if I can find it. Not that one. There they are. I could do that edition to get myself some pretty uniform prints. Once I was happy with the edition and where we'll head more next week, I could then start playing with how I'm printing this plate in a variety of ways. So the first thing I did was lay in some decorative paper and create a print with shinkolay, where this yellow is not ink. It is lightweight, probably shikisu paper that's been pigmented that color. It's all printed at the same time. I did a couple of variations of shinkolay. This super light, just slightly buff colored paper as well. These more painterly shinkolay papers. I can go into working with viscosity or surface roll prints, where now all of the color is via ink, not via shinkolay paper. It's all done again at the same time. I can go into working more a la poupée and applying multiple colors of ink to one plate at the same time and printing that. And then I can work with multiple plates and print one on top of another in registration, where one of those plates in this instance was mono printed and one of those plates was the dry point plate. And all of this is where I'm hoping to get you over the next week. And Deb.
I have a couple questions. I don't want to interrupt, the whole class for Christine, but I just have a couple questions about this. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Okay. First of all, I love these little prints.
Thank you.
I don't know. I do. I think that it's really appealing to me because I know I've tried dry point and all of that. It's very intensive, getting all the ink off. It's messy, it's whatever, and it takes a while. So I like the idea. These are really manageable, especially at home in a small space. So, and I like your print.
Thank you.
Did you find the little plates already cut, or you asked somebody to cut them to size for you, or?
This plate is the same 18 gauge plexiglass that I'm working with this evening. And it was a 5x7 plate. All I did to cut it, truly, it just took a lot of patience and a very sharp X-Acto knife, a ruler, and a straight edge. And at some point when I can get almost 3/4 of the way cut through, I can snap the plate and then just sand my edges so they're a little smoother.
All right, so I think I need to get 18 gauge. I think what I have is either those Akua plates, the real thin, and then I think the plexi I have is too thick. So I'm gonna get that for the next class.
I think if we're sort of eyeballing this, this is
Yeah.
probably as thick as a dime.
Yeah, much thicker.
If you're a little bit thicker than that, it's just going to take longer to pass through with it. But
I think I think it's thicker.
It does look a little bit thicker. Yeah. Almost.
Yeah, so I'll get some of that. I'm glad, that's what I wanted to ask you because they look thinner. And then you're gonna go over, I guess next week would be a good time to ask the question as far as like multiple plates, as far as the embossing goes. I always confuse how that lands perfectly, or if you end up with double. And then also the viscosity that you're talking about, how you would print that, that's all gonna be next week, right?
Yeah.
Okay, and I do like the chine collé that way with the whole piece. I've seen it with the little pieces and pieces cut, and I've tried that, and I kind of, that's not necessarily the things that I've tried and gave up on. I didn't like the effect on my plates, but I love these different papers that already have the variations.
Yeah.
And I like the way it covers the whole plate.
So
that's a different way that I've never seen it done like that before, but of course I'm still learning. So
yeah, chine collé.
Anyway.
Chine collé can be super collagey, where it is small bits of paper meant to highlight very specific elements. I prefer chine collé that is either like full sheet coverage, and this one here and this one here, these two are actually silk screen monoprints done on Kitakata. So it's a process that I can then cut down and glue for chine collé. The one is just yellow paper. The tan one is just tan paper. But there are ways to work in other processes that can enhance your dry points. Not much that I'll talk about in this class, but you could certainly monoprint a full sheet of lightweight Kitakata or Sekishu or Kodo, cut it down to size and use that as sort of the landing space for your prints.
And you wouldn't have to screen it. You wouldn't have to screen it, right? I mean, you could do the painterly effect even with Akua, right? But Akua really takes a long time to dry, but I guess you could, right?
You could. Akua, the issues I have with Akua, and this is a rant for a separate day, so I'll keep it short.
Yeah.
I have with Akua are that Akua colors or Akua pigments rather don't dry as rich as they look in the container. So your black sort of dries a little bit grayer, your reds dry a little bit muted, your yellows and blues dry a little bit lighter because they're being absorbed into the paper rather than drying on the surface of the paper like an oil-based ink. The other issue I have with Akua, specifically with monoprinting, is that a very layered monoprint, because Akua requires open, unprinted paper to absorb into, once that paper is saturated with Akua ink, that ink has nowhere to go and it dry just by exposure to air. So it will take truly forever, and in some cases never, for that print to dry.
Yeah. I have similar rants about Akua, and I'm not even a professional printmaker, but I have my things. So I guess you could really just even roll randomly and wipe. I'm looking at this one in the center with the orange and the white. You could probably even just roll oil-based ink very thin on those, plate on a plate.
Absolutely. I'm looking.
And wipe or do whatever you want to it. and print that Kitakata paper and let it dry first. Okay, thank you. I didn't mean to take the whole class. I'm just looking at it going, oh my gosh, I love those little prints.
So
Thank you.
if you want to prep a couple of things for next week, if you get there, these are just that Kitakata screen printed.
Yep, I have some of that too. Oh,
And these are, oh, there's another one.
if I get brave and get my screen out. I'm so afraid of it.
Use that. So this one here, actually all of these, I think, these are just newsprint that I use to clean off my brayers in another class. I was just rolling the ink.
That's true. Oh my gosh, I've gotten papers that I love that I go, oh, you're right. Oh my gosh.
This strip here was a demo from another class in viscosity. Again, just on newsprint. This is what came off my roller when I was cleaning my roller.
Yeah, you're right. There's so many interesting things that come off the roller. Sometimes you go, oh, I don't want to get rid of this. That could be.
This is
Thank
a for that. Yeah.
Sorry, Christine. Sorry for interrupting.
Don't apologize.
Okay.
So-
What a good idea. Okay.
Yeah. So if you want to prep some stuff for next week,
Mhm.
I don't think I mentioned it in your material needs, but for prepping Shinkolei, all you really need for this process is just a white Elmer's glue stick, not Elmer's glue in a bottle, not methyl cellulose, just
Right.
glue in a
Yeah.
will be good to
Yeah.
go. So we are at a proofing and printing stage. I'm gonna pull these to the side. This was the other, just briefly, the difference between Shinkolei and non-Shinkolei. This is a really deeply rich aqua tint on a piece of copper. I have the plate somewhere. Printed without Shinkolei, with Shinkolei, super subtle. It's actually showing up way more on camera than it does in person. But that little bit of Shinkolei just helps ground the print rather than this just big white empty space without being super overpowering. But you can also get really, really crazy with your Shinkolei if you wanted to. Slide all these to the side and you'll see more of this next week. I'll do a little bit more printing over the next couple of days as well. And we'll talk about printing. So I'm gonna need my inking station. I don't know what I did with that. Really good question. I'll just grab another one. Joys of working in my own studio. So inking station, I'm gonna put out a little bit of ink. First, I'm gonna put on some gloves. And like I said, when you're done with your plate, when you're done marking up your plate, at least for this proofing stage, you may not be done with it entirely. You'll want to rinse your plate off with dish soap and water. Let it dry or dry it very thoroughly so that you can get to working on this pretty quickly. It's got my inking surface, my plate. I apologize that you can't really see that super well, but I'll do what I can because I don't have anything I can put that on. That scrap of paper, though. Huzzah. All right. Take out a little bit of ink, and depending on the ink you are working with, whether it is oil-based or soy-based, even water-based if you want to explore that possibility, you may need to modify your ink just a little bit to get it to a slightly more workable consistency. What we're looking for ultimately is a stiffer ink, somewhere in the range of like toothpaste to peanut butter, that isn't super sticky. Now, traditionally, we'd modify this with plate oil or linseed oil or some sort of tack reducer in a pinch, or sort of truly deeply in pandemic times, a little bit of olive oil, baby oil, or vegetable oil would do the same. And we're talking like the tiniest amount of drop. Ideally, if you're sticking more in like kitchen oils, A safflower oil is a better option. One, it doesn't bleed nearly as much as other oils. Two, it is colorless, odorless, and fairly neutral, so it's not going to yellow over time. But if you have access to or can get access to a plate oil or a tack reducer or a linseed oil, that would be fine. You could also thin out an oil-based ink with just a little bit of mineral spirits as well. If you're working water-based or soy-based with Akua, those Akua inks are already pretty thin and a little bit runny. Do not try to modify them to get them less sticky or thinner. If you can modify them with their mag mix, I think, which is magnesium carbonate, to get it a little bit thicker, that's great. But with Akua, there's a lot more flexibility in working with their inks, a good benefit of Akua, so that you don't necessarily need to modify your inks for things. My ink I've already modified with just a little bit of linseed oil to thin out and remove a little bit of tackiness. I'm going to grab my chipboard that I've cut. I'm just going to pick up a little bit of ink. No part of the inking and wiping of plates looks any different from printing by hand as it does from printing via press. I'm going to start from the middle of the plate and work all the way around my plate in a variety of directions, because if I only stroke this plate in one direction, I'm going to be picking up more ink out of this plate than I'm actually putting onto the plate, especially if my lines only go in a handful or one or two directions. I'm going to push some ink all the way across this plate. I'm not going to stand up, but I would normally do this standing because I can get better leverage on this. And using either a new chipboard or the other side, the other edge of that chipboard, I'm then going to go in and those same motions with a little bit less pressure, try and remove some of that excess ink, kicking it off onto the glass. Until I can just see the inking surface behind it. I'm not looking to see the entirety of my imagery, but I can see a little bit of it. Yeah, and I'm just going there. Now in traditional printing at a studio, you'd work with tarlatan, and you'd work with a dirty tarlatan and a clean tarlatan and do a quick clean with both to get off much of that surface ink. If you don't have tarlatan, that is okay. You can work without tarlatan. Our plate is at a state where we can kind of see behind it. I'm going to grab some newsprint, some clean newsprint or some phone book pages, doesn't really matter. And where we're going to start is just by laying the newsprint on top of this and lightly with the fattest part of my hand here, just going to stick the newsprint to the plate and peel up. And I'm going to start pulling off some of that excess ink. You can use your fingers. You don't want to apply a huge amount of pressure, because really what we're looking for is just removing that surface layer of ink. Not going to do much visually, but it's going to change drastically how we interact in our next step. Just looking for a place to deposit this garbage. There we go. Move this out of the way. Once you've gotten some of that excess ink off, and really what you're looking for is that the chipboard is going to sort of leave brush strokes. You're looking to sort of minimize that a lot with the newsprint. You're not going to get them entirely, but they're not going to be nearly as sharp. They're going to be a little bit more blurred. That's a good sign that you've gotten some of that ink off this plate. Then I like to hold my plate in my hands and using newsprint just like you would phone book pages or newsprint in a more traditional printing setting. Just go in, and with the fattest part of my palm now, so this whole area, not my fingers, I can sort of hyper flex my fingers like that. Just going to wipe in circles this plate, not only focusing on the center of the plate, but the edges of the plate, the sides of the plate, and right up to the very ends of the plate. Working in circles, wiping it, swapping out the newsprint when it gets dirty. If you go in with your fingers in this state or your knuckles in this state, what you're doing is picking up the ink sort of inconsistently. So you might wind up with streaks or marks or areas where the newsprint has pulled too much ink out of your plate. By working on the fattest part of your palm there, you sort of can minimize the amount of sort of area that is getting a huge amount of pressure, because the weight of your hand and the fattiness of your palm is going to disperse that a little bit more evenly. And you're going to wipe your plate until you get a little bit more of your imagery seen. Now there's some ink on the back of this, and there's still some ink. So these black dots here, 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 and here is area of stippling. I'll bring up that print so you can get a good reminder of that. You can see, if you think about this in reverse, areas of stippling. And because the stipple is so deep, it's collecting ink not only in those dots, but around that burr. Because that stippling is also so concentrated, the areas between the dots are also catching ink as well. Once I can see my imagery a little bit more clearly, I'm gonna not use black gloves next week, I can then go in with smaller bits of newsprint and my ring finger or my pinky. We use these because they are your least strong fingers. So again, like we use the palm of our hand to disperse some of that weight, we can use our least strong fingers to do a little bit more detail wiping. Again, working in circles, flipping the newsprint or replacing the newsprint when we need to get a little bit more of that detail on the plate that we are looking for. Addition printing or even proofing is a step that I always sort of relate to, especially in this first iteration, always relate to sort of as like a first date. You're going to get to know your plate a little bit more. You're going to get to know where you need to apply more pressure to remove more ink, where you need to apply less pressure because you want some of that ink to stay on the plate. It is very likely that your first proof isn't a true visual of what your plate actually looks like, but for going in and working more on the plate, it's just as good as any. But as you print this plate more and more, even in the realm of printing on a press, the more you wipe, the more times you print this, you ink and wipe and print, the better you'll get to know how your plate likes to be wiped. Now, I've printed this plate a number of times, so I have a slightly better idea of how this likes to be wiped. And I can go in and focus a little bit more on those areas. Again, I'm working with really tiny bits, like fingertip-sized bits of newsprint to do my wiping. You also really want to focus on running your finger along the edge of your plate because it is likely that your imagery may not extend all the way to the edge of the plate, but because the way plexiglass is manufactured and cut, that edge of the plate is going to catch a little bit more ink along either your own cut from your X-Acto knife or the blade cut from it actually being cut at the manufacturer. And you also want to clean the actual edges or vertical sides of your plate. The best way to do that for me, with a paper towel wrapped around my finger, I can lift my plate and carefully wipe just the sides. The inked side of my plate is here, sort of riding my finger along my plate so that the paper towel can't really get to the front side of it. I'm really angled as if I'm wiping the back of the plate, and I've just snuck over the side there so that none of that paper towel is going to pick up ink off the surface of the plate. I'm going to do that on all 4 sides.
Dave,
Yes.
can I ask, will you talk about additioning in the next class? Is that a good time to ask that question?
If you have
How you decide? I'm sorry, go ahead.
a question now, I'm happy to walk through.
Oh, yeah, I have a question, like, do you just randomly decide how many you want to print in an edition? I'm always confused about what the artist proof is. And then if you are doing the machine collé, is it referred to then as a varied edition?
So I'll make a note when my hands aren't covered in ink that I will send you a document that I put together about designating your prints.
Oh,
and
great.
How you would designate a different, like something with shin collé as opposed to a more traditional edition or a variable edition, or your state proofs. I'll send that along as well, so that you have that. But truthfully, a lot of that is up to the individual artist. When I was in college and post-college, loved the idea of giant editions of intaglio prints that were 25, 30, 40, 50 prints. I would say 98% of those prints are sitting in my flat files still. So for me, in the past 10, 15 years or so, I've gotten more realistic with my editions. My editions are 5, 10 at most. My screen prints are slightly larger editions because they're much easier to pull. But truthfully, like, I'm not going to edition this 40 times because there are not 40 people who want this print. There is hardly one person who wants to look at this print anymore. But a lot of that edition is the artist's decision, and if a print publisher is making the print, like a Tamarind or a Crown Point or Durham Press here in Pennsylvania, if they've predetermined how many they want based on pre-sales or interest or whatnot. When it comes to artist proofs or state proofs, color proofs, trial proofs, variable editions, there are a lot of different criteria that need to be met for those things, and I can send you all of that information. We can talk much deeper about that.
Thank you.
So the one note that I will give you before I print this, and I'm pretty much at that point of printing, is that if you've ever wiped an intaglio plate for press printing, whether it's an etching plate, a dry point plate, a mezzotint plate, you essentially want your plate to look like your print. You want the areas of no marking to be as clean as possible. You want the areas of dark to be as dark as possible. You want your midtones to look like you want them to print. When you're printing by hand, because we aren't dependent on the couple hundred pounds to couple hundred tons, depending on our plate size and our press size, that a press can give us. Oh, we just lost Deb. She'll be back. We want to leave the plate just a little bit dirtier. There she is. We want to leave the plate, that's okay. We want to leave the plate just a little bit dirtier. And again, this is about knowing your plate and knowing what is too clean and what is too dirty. It's going to take you some time to figure that out. Allowing for a little bit extra ink on your plate means that you stand a better chance of getting more ink off the plate because you're completely dependent on how much pressure you can pull from your hands and arms. So my plate is just a little bit dirtier. And here is where I'll talk about what I mentioned an hour ago, a matte side of your plate versus a shiny side of your plate. A shiny side of your plate is going to wipe much cleaner, much shinier, much whiter, much quicker. The matte side of your plate, even at your best wiping in this process, will almost always leave you some sort of plate tone, which is just the tiniest haze of ink left on the plate. And I did have a good example of that somewhere. There it is. This plate, same plate, this print rather, is a little bit gray. This plate is underwiped. That gray is plate tone. This plate is wiped as I would like it and is much whiter because this plate was developed on the shiny side of the plate. If you develop your plate on the matte side of your plate, you will almost always have a tiny bit of gray on the surface of your print, which can be really great. It can lead to some really nice atmosphere, but if you're looking for crisp, white, non-inked areas, make sure that you develop your plate, you scratch into your plate on the shiny side of your plate. If you don't have a matte side, wonderful. You don't have to think about this at all. I have my plate inked. I am ready to print. Let's move some more of this stuff out of the way. My newsprint.
Dave, while you're doing that, my internet went out. I apologize. I missed what you said. So leave more ink on for the first print,
yes.
Is what you're saying? Okay.
In general, when you're printing by hand, you want to leave a little bit more ink on the plate for proofing purposes or under any circumstances, because our hands aren't going to pull nearly as much ink out of the plate as the press will. So it's just about giving us a better chance of getting more ink off this plate, and knowing that there's a little bit of nuance that might happen in there. Just going to shift all of this out of my way so I can bring in my clean stuff. We are back then to this, to our tape or contact paper covered guide. I'm going to take my plate. I've also removed my gloves because my hands are now clean because I need to handle clean paper. Take my plate and place it in the center of my guide. I will give you one slight tip. If you find that trying to get better light on this. If you find that your plate in the printing of this tends to slip a little bit, take a little bit of spit or a little spray of water or even a little sponge drop of water onto your printing surface, place your plate down on top of that, and just that suction from the water is going to hold your plate in place a little bit better than it just free-flowing here. Move that to the side for now. I'm going to grab a sheet of paper out of my wet pack. Going to dab off excess water from both sides. Oh, what are you, friend? You're fun. I will give you one more tip. Because we are printing by hand and to compensate again for not having the pressure of the press, leave your paper just a little bit more wet than you normally would under normal circumstances. So if you've never done this before, normally you would get your paper to a point where it no longer has shine and it's just damp, like just slightly dampened, even though it's been soaking for however long. Now, I still want to remove the shine, but I want the paper to be just a little bit more wet, a little bit colder, because the air conditioning's on in here, so that it can flex a little bit more into the cracks and crevices of my plate here. Again, first date, some things might not be ideal for you, but you'll get there, I promise. Line up your plate. Line up your paper, and I usually do this by finding one edge on my guide, dropping my paper along that edge, and then dropping my paper freely down onto the top of my plate. Grab my sheet of glassine or parchment or wax paper, place it on top, and then there are, I'm just gonna grab a different one that doesn't have ink all over the back. There's one very specific rule that I will give you. Once you've made your print sandwich here, we don't have blankets. We don't have the weight of the press or the weight of the blankets to hold everything in place. Your non-dominant hand never leaves the back of your plate until you are done printing. I'm going to show you printing with two different tools, a bone folder and a metal spoon, because I realize you might not all have bone folders. I'm going to start with the metal spoon, and I'm going to hold it sort of in my hand like this with my pointer finger, or even my pointer and middle finger in the bowl of the spoon. I'm going to start at the middle of the plate, and here I'm going to stand. I will adjust my camera so you're not just looking at my chest the entire time. There we go. Hold my print, hold my plate. I can even feel the edges of my plate. And in small but very heavy circles, I'm going to work this all around my plate, really applying as much pressure as I can to the back side of this. The wax paper, the parchment, the glassine is doing everything it can to minimize the amount of friction behind it so that this should glide pretty smoothly. Of all three, parchment is the best option because it's got that little bit of like silicone on it that's going to allow for this to really move very freely. It's also not going to absorb any of the moisture from the back of your plate. You're going to go all over the surface of the plate with your spoon, even finding the edge of your plexi and creating that plate mark. If at any point you need to switch hands, if you happen to be ambidextrous, or if you happen to feel that you can do a little bit more with your other hand, switch hands and do the same thing. But at no point should your plate and print and paper rather not be supported. Because if you knock the table, or if someone comes in and disrupts you and something shifts, you're going to wind up with a double print, a double plate mark, a print you're not super happy with, and so on. I'm going to switch off the spoon and go in with the bone folder because it's a slightly different holding. Most bone folders have a rounded edge and a pointy edge. Truly, it doesn't matter which one you use. I prefer the pointy edge, and I hold it a little bit more like I hold an X-Acto knife. And I'm going to work, again, in circles with as much pressure as I can all around this plate. Now, you might ask yourself, well, how in the heck will I know when this is done? When have I pressed hard enough? When have I covered my entire plate? Have I found all of my edges? The reason we always keep one hand on the plate is so that we can check this as we're printing. Come back down. Keep one hand supported on one end of the plate. Lift my glassine. Lift one side of the paper, and I can take a look and see what has printed. Now I know, because I know this plate, that I can get more of an impression off of this. I'm gonna do the same thing, drop that back down, check the other side, and know that I can still get more of an impression off this plate. So I can go back in and continue working all around this. This is not quick. This is not the process that I would use for large additions, but this is a great way to work around not having access to a press. We continue working all across this, and a plate this size, a plate in the 5x7 range, should take you somewhere in the range of like 6, 7, 8 minutes to really get correctly. If you've gone longer than 10, you're probably doing too much. If you've gone less than 5, you haven't done nearly enough. I'm just gonna find those plate edges again, and with my bone folder, I can really sharpen that plate mark, make this look way more like a traditional etching. Swap out my glassine because it has now started absorbing moisture. Let's do one more check. It's getting there, but not going to make you watch me print for 10 minutes. When you are happy with how that looks upon sneak peek, just flip everything up and over and inspect. So at this point, you have your plate and a proof of your plate, and that proof should look pretty close. You followed everything I've said, should look pretty close to what your print should actually look like. This is where then you can mark up your proof and designate that this is TP1, trial proof 1, and you can go in and say, cool, looking at my print, I was expecting more darkness to happen here, and I don't see that there's a huge amount of ink left on that plate, so it means I have to go in and scratch more in to here to get more darkness. I was expecting more stippling here, so I'm going to go in and designate that I need more stippling here. I want to darken this up as well, and I want to bring a little bit of cross-hatching right into here. This is going to tell you, if you don't do it within the same day, is going to tell you what needs to happen to this plate in order to get you happier with this. By class next week, if you have the time, I would love for you to have proofed once and made those additions to your plate. You're welcome to proof as many times as you want. You're welcome to make as many additions to the plate as you want. You're welcome to make as many plates as you want. But I would love next week, so that we have something to play with, for you to have a plate that is print ready, so that we can talk about all of those decorative techniques: chincolle, ala poupe, viscosity, and multi-plate registration. You've gotten the hang of printing and knowing those skills, so that we can begin to focus on the steps beyond printing. What your plate looks like content-wise doesn't make a lick of difference to me. I would love to see imagery and plates next week, whether they're more realistic, more abstract, more decorative, whatever. But I'm less concerned about what the plate looks like, and more concerned that you've got a good good idea of how the printing process happens over and over and over again. Because we'll be doing a fair amount of printing next week in class. Questions before I set you off for the evening?
Dave,
Yes.
so you did your trial print. Now, is it necessary to go back and clean off that whole plate, all the ink, or can you, I would assume you have to clean it first, or do you, if you're using the same color ink, do you just go back over it for the next print?
For printing or for going in and doing more manipulation to the plate?
Oh, well, I guess both. So if you need to go back into the plate, do you need to clean it or not? And then if you say, well, my plate is the way I want it, I'm going to keep doing additions. You don't have pieces for the addition. You do or don't have to clean it each time.
So if you're doing more work onto the plate, I would suggest cleaning the plate thoroughly, letting it dry, and then doing the work you need to do. If you're happy with the print and want to continue printing, you do not need to clean this until you are done for the day.
Okay.
The only thing I would suggest is whether you're using Akua ink or oil-based ink or water-based ink, at the end of your printing session, whether that's tonight or tomorrow, or however long that printing session is, make sure your plate is fully clean, fully dry before you put it away. Any ink that's left in here, really with the exception of Akua, but even Akua isn't great for that, may dry and change the way, certainly change the depth of your marks, change the subtlety of your marks. So you want to make sure that you get this as clean as you can, knowing full well that all the new texture on your plate is never going to come sparkling clean again, but you want to get off all of the excess ink you can while you can. And all I've done for my oil-based ink, I took a little bit of mineral oil, or baby oil, which is just mineral oil with the smell of baby, and cleaned my plate to get all of that ink off. You can do the same thing with vegetable oil, and then I'll just run this underwater with a little bit of dish soap to get rid of that greasy residue.
I usually use the Aqua Wash.
Yep, that works too.
Ink, so that should just be soap and water. I actually find that they clean up better even than the Caligo soap and water, but maybe that's just me. I don't know. It comes right off my brayers and everything. So
the Aqua Wash stuff, and even the Caligo Aquarelle, I think, that's Charbonnel.
The Safe Wash.
Yeah, the Safe Wash clean up really well and will work really well for these processes. It's just about what cleanup do you need to do for your inks.
Yeah. Okay.
Much more oil-based ink printer. So a lot of my cleanup, I try to avoid mineral spirits as much as I can. Sometimes I can, but in my home studio, it's vegetable oil, it's baby oil, it's mineral oil, it's things that aren't gonna kill me.
Right. That's always a good thing.
And then again, because this is covered in tape or contact paper, this wipes up beautifully clean for you as well. So where I will leave you this evening, I've done an awful lot of talking. Where I will leave you this evening, experiment, make multiple plates if you've got multiple sheets of plexi. Make an exploratory plate, make an example plate of what your different tools might do. Make a plate of, like I said, tools or materials that you don't think you'd normally like, because that might open up some doors for you. And then do at least one trial proof or one proof print of all of the plates that you've made, whether it's one or 74 of them, so that next week we can come into class with more familiarity with our plates, more familiarity with our printing process, so that we can really dive into addition printing and then all of those other decorative techniques. And if you have any questions over the course of the week, you've got my email address, shoot me an email, and I will happily answer things as they come across my desk. And like I said, for Wednesday or on Wednesday, look out for an email from me with the link to our private YouTube page, as well as all of the resources that I promised you this evening. I will include in that email as well. But if you have questions, you know how to get in touch. Other than that, I will see you all next Monday evening.
Thanks, Dave.
Welcome.
This
Have a
is really good. Very good.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thank
Have a
you.
and I will see you all in a week.
Okay, good night.
Okay, thanks.